This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. I'm Ashley Newby, and today I have Dr. David Green, Associate Professor in English at Howard University. He's also the director of the writing program. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Had my tea. Woke up early for this conversation, so yeah. And I was really excited about your invitation to participate in this. The description was really interesting, and it seems fun. So I was interested to dialogue with you.
Well, I definitely appreciate your time and waking up early in the summer for this conversation. So I like to start with kind of getting an understanding of why you got into Black studies as a field. So what drew you in and what keeps you committed to the work of Black studies?
I think for me, the answer, it always comes back to like family and friends and really where I grew up, Newark, New Jersey. There was not a lot of, say, information or education really around kind of Black culture. The things that I was seeing and experiencing, within my family and within my larger kind of family network. But we were always, often provided like books at a very young age. I think I got the autobiography of Malcolm X. I was maybe 9 or 10 years old. I had just really started reading it, to be clear, I got the children's version and I got the thick Alex Haley version as well. But those kind of experiences were really pivotal in my interest in Black culture. And then when we got to high school, we read more books. I always had an affinity really for Black literature, really fiction. I think I read Bluest Eye at a very early age by Morrison. And then music, really, Black music was another real big kind of influence on my interest, really, or my pathway into understanding of Black culture, what it is, what it can mean. History texts came a little later as I got to high school as well. But a lot of this stuff was provided by family, friends, my community. And then maybe schooling might touch on a text or two, an idea or two that was very helpful to me to kind of process, the different worlds I was experiencing. So I had my family world in the larger neighborhood of Newark, New Jersey. And then when we went other places, I won't say things were segregated, but you had a kind of de facto segregation, I would say, in like the 80s and early 90s. There were definitely, more white neighborhoods, and you could tell the difference when you moved into those spaces. And then camps, kind of schools that I went to, were very mixed. And so, that was another place of distinction where there was this reality of things that we were interested and invested in as a family. If Whitney Houston came on, if there was a soul music award show that was on and folks were singing, even if there was good gospel kind of, right? These were all moments and touchstones that shaped my world, but were very different, say from some classmates or even how teachers approach topics, subject matters. It was like certain artists and writers like almost didn't exist. So that kind of contrast really kind of built up my interest at an early age. And then that was fostered. It was fostered in high school. It was fostered again in undergrad when I became an English major and began to learn more formally about African American literature. And then all the way through my schooling. And it really just helped me process, the things that are like beneficial, fun, like these are touchstone moments within your family environment. Every Christmas time, every Thanksgiving, certain songs are going to be played, people are going to have certain kinds of jokes or language games that they play, as well. And it was really a way to kind of account for that And it was really a way to help me kind of understand as a, community, as a Black people, where we come from and what is our history, because that was just not provided, in my schooling at a very early age, or really, maybe not until grad school, was I able to kind of get the deep dive to understanding the history of, what happened during slavery, how certain cultural traditions were passed on, and, how they make their way into my family, and some of the things that we do. So it was really that understanding what keeps me connected, and then the ability to kind of provide that for folks who are are in a similar position that I was in, and trying to understand just the value of Black culture, the value of our history, the value of our language practices, and so on and so forth. So that's really what keeps me connected, invested, interested. Every time somebody mentions, oh, why was Black History Month given to us in February? Yeah, it's like a moment to be like, Carter G. Woodson, he put some thought into this, way back when you started Negro History Week. So it's not necessarily something that was given to all of this stuff is not something that was given to us, by a government or by a school system or board of education. These are histories, traditions, customs that have been thought through and passed down, as a people. So I've always loved and appreciate that. So to answer your question along with it, nature is just like, that's what keeps me connected. It keeps me excited. I'm always discovering new things. I'm always in conversation with people about that. So that's really what kind of drives my interest and my pathway into Black studies writ large. And so, while I may just cover a small area under that, hip hop, language, literature, so on and so forth, it is the larger kind of understanding of our traditions, histories, customs that really keeps me coming back.
So, in that vein, right, in thinking about the area within the larger field of Black studies that you are situated, you are in English and language and hip hop and all of that. One is super important to the field, but disciplinarily, right, English is considered or has a whole discipline of its own. So, how do you situate yourself in relationship to English and then like Black studies?
So that was a question I had been working through for a long time. I really, thank my mentor, Keith Gilliard, for kind of helping me think through that at a very early age. But my investment in English came early. My mother's an English teacher. I'd be remiss to mention that. And so she was both my parents were providing those books, but she was someone who had a kind of vested interest, lesson plans, kind of shaping and framing my interest and investment in that area. So it was just something I kind of went along to get along with in schooling. I was good at it. I kind of understood how texts related to each other, some of the symbolism that was embedded in these texts, and so on and so forth. But there's that imperial structure to the idea of English that always didn't always sit well. You have to, even today, a lot of people equate the idea of English studies with proper speech or grammar and punctuation correction and things of that nature. That is really just not how I came to it. My English teacher in high school, one of the first and dopest assignments we had was we had to develop a playlist, but he called it a mixtape review. And we had to review these albums and select songs on them, and then provide our list of the top songs after. And that was just so much fun. I was like, yeah, we could do this. Like, I can do this. Like, if this is what English can be, this is something that I can do. And so my investment kind of started there. But going through college and graduate school, there's still that kind of larger imperial kind of understanding of English studies and what the discipline means and what it provides. And I always appreciated the investment, the ways that I could move into Black studies from that vantage point, in particular ways. And so really how I was able to kind of make sense of it, English studies, and really, my investment is in rhetoric and language kind of studies. I come My first initial foray into kind of graduate school and thinking about taking this to the master's and the PhD level was really the work of Geneva Smitherman. I think a linguist at my undergraduate school alma mater, Hampton University. Margaret Lee provided me with Talking That Talk. And then later, was it Talking and Testifying? She provided me with a couple, as I kept reading, she kept providing me with more books by Dr. G. Um, and that really was like, okay, this is a way I can begin to study what I'm interested in. So if I can focus on and have a better understanding of how Black language shapes these literary texts, these novels that I'm reading, what is Toni Morrison doing with Black language that is different than other writers? I have a pathway and I have a focus and I have an area I can kind of key in on. As I mentioned, Keith Gillard was the one who expanded that and really allowed me to think about expressive Black discourse as my way into both English studies and pairing that with my ongoing interest in kind of Black studies and Black cultural studies. Um, I think I asked the question as a graduate student, was like, well, how do you do all of this, all these studies that we do? How do you begin to produce these books that, folks like Mark Anthony Neal and um, Greg Tate and those folks who are really doing innovative work in Black culture and music were doing. And he just provided me with the term of studying Black expressive culture and Black expressive discourse. Um, and this being kind of the larger area in which we can study and think about these things. And there's a whole history, trajectory. There's a number of different studies in these areas that contribute to our larger knowledge of how language works, how literature or literary writing also works, and then more importantly, how discourse, or I'll use speech, language, circulates the Black community. So really why I think one of the first examples that was given to me was presidential speech. So why was Bill Clinton termed, our first Black president, falsely, but there were kind of performative Black language features in what he was doing. His affinity for music and all of these different features was something for folks to grasp onto. And then later, we get a similar question when Barack Obama runs for president as well. And while his speech is not that traditional preacher sermonic kind of tradition, it does fall within a Black language tradition, as a number of folks have pointed out, because of the features, because of the way he references his ability to move between text and history and so on and so forth. And it was that understanding. It was like, okay, this is, what I can study. This is what I'm kind of interested in. Because it's a bit different. It's interdisciplinary, at its heart. So it's different than how some people come to kind of graduate studies where you have a set approach, set methodology. You have to apply it. You have to figure out a problem. I'm gonna figure out a group to study and so forth, and then I'm gonna apply it and do it in kind of very rigorous or methodological ways folks kind of describe it. And so I was able to discover a kind of rigor and methodology for doing the interdisciplinary work. How does music kind of inform our understanding of certain speech performances? How do certain Black language practices shape our understanding of particular texts and maybe the double or hidden meanings that are invested or embedded in these texts as well? And so it's like, okay, I got a space to kind of engage this. And so that was my pathway really into Black studies, and something I feel like I can contribute to. And just understanding that there's a tradition there. There's folks, as I mentioned, Mark Anthony Neal, but there's a number of Nelson George. There's a number of folks on the cultural critic side. Cornel West, he was very important to my studies as well. Bell Hooks. So there's a number of folks who are kind of important to thinking about this kind of interdisciplinary work. And there's a tradition I can kind of move into, coming in. It's like, are you reading Faulkner, or are you reading, like, who are you going to read and who are you going to study? And are you going to study these classic poems and so forth? And I really didn't come to English from that vantage point. I came to English with an interest in really kind of like Toni Morrison, Ernest Gaines, I had read and saw the piano lesson. Later on, A Gathering of Old Men was a text I was provided. Richard Wright's Black Boy was an early kind of memoir. And I was like, oh, people are writing like this. Um, so that was really how I came into it, but it was hard to describe. It was hard to explain to folks because of the ways that Black culture, language, and literature gets devalued, even subtly within our educational system and in our larger culture at times. So it's like, I've had the experience where you're like, who are you studying? And, I'm really interested in James Baldwin and John Edgar Wideman and Toni Morrison, and folks would say, I have never heard of any of those writers. And you're like, whoa. So that was just an important kind of moment for me as well, because it was also like, these writers are important to our broader culture. This is something that I could provide, insight, perspective on to folks in the broader culture. And Black studies has kind of always been about, breaking barriers, exploding assumptions that we may have about Black culture, really doing that deep dive. And so there was a natural draw kind of in that way. And then being able to, work between or at the intersections of these different disciplines has really been fruitful for me. It was my pathway to academia, but then really into larger kind of public cultural questions.
Thank you. That was interesting, and it made me think about especially the rhetoric component. So, like, that's very interesting to me personally, the rhetoric, but also within, like, as the director of writing program and as someone who focuses on English and rhetoric, what we do in a writing classroom, since that was my first job when I graduated, what what that looks like in Black studies. And in so many places, teaching first and second year writing, teaching communication, teaching the courses that are oftentimes required for students to take, what does that look like if you're doing it from a Black studies perspective? So
Yeah.
I am most
Yeah.
interested in general in what people do pedagogically in the classroom.
hmm And that was a really important area in my graduate studies, was thinking about my pedagogy and how does this play out in the classroom and for what classes. And as somebody who works in, as I mentioned, at the intersection, interdisciplinary, I've taught a number of, classes in literature, language, also in culture and writing, but writing has always been at the center, uh, in part because I've always, felt like a struggling writer in some way, A lot of that had to do with kind of cultural difference, managing differences in certain ways. And so, we have colloquial phrases in Black culture that you may put in your speech, and the teacher kind of crosses that out and tells you it's not supposed to be there. Um, and I used to struggle with it. I'm like, nah, but it's making my paper funky. Like, I thought we could do what we want. That's how you kind of presented it to us. Be creative and explorative. Um, and so that was a kind of burning question. In fact, that was one of the questions I asked, as I mentioned, my undergraduate linguistics instructor, Margaret Lee, um, just about in terms of writing. And that's what led us to Dr. Geneva Smitherman. But really, my perspective has grown most around writing and having to, as you mentioned, having to teach. And then my first job having to teach, 2 or 3 sections of composition each semester, then eventually becoming the writing program director. And so um, a large part of my area of studies early on was in composition studies, very specifically how people think about writing, the different parts of writing from the invention phase or the brainstorming phase, we may call it, to the other different processes, whether that is kind of early revision, early drafting, um, different kinds of acts of editing, kind of thinking through paragraphs, structures, transitions, all of these things, were things that I had no formal knowledge of, and kind of gaining that knowledge helped me think more creatively and critically about my own Black language, which is what I appreciated about composition studies very early on. And rhetoric was just a tool that helped me think through it. Rhetoric being the study of in any given situation, the available means of persuasion, or rather, we could think about it as the different ways that people use communication to effectively organize, persuade, or inform folks about what's happening um, in any given situation. And so, composition studies, or the actual act of writing, is the organizing of these intentions, the intention to effectively communicate an idea, the intention to effectively express what's happening. Um, and I think, as I mentioned, that my interest in music was also really important to that, because I always saw music as a different form of composition that we don't talk about. So the writing that people like Lauryn Hill, but we can even go back further, Aretha Franklin, and Whitney Houston. I was very appreciative. Like, these were folks whose ideas and their expressions of soul kind of shaped me, and these were, coming to understand those as possible models for how I think about writing was just huge. And so I've always wanted to kind of pass that understanding on for others who are like me, who, the formal and kind of structural stuff about writing can be very boring at times. And an over attention to it can be paralyzing, at times, if you if you worry too much about transitions, or if you worry too much about um, the structure of your sentences, you can get bogged down and lose what it is you're trying to express or convey to a particular audience. And so, being able to move back and forth, rhetoric allowed me to kind of take a bird's eye view, and then also key in on different elements of writing that were important to the larger whole of what people are doing. Um, and so, Black studies kind of really provides this, I want to say counterculture, but this understanding that the way things are presented to us is not the only way, right? Or it's not the only narrative, or it's not even the most accurate narrative all the time. And so that perspective just helped a lot in beginning to think about what are the different ways we should present writing to folks to keep them writing and invested in language and the structuring of language in particular ways. I think so many people still to this day, I'm not a good writer. I don't really like to write, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of that has to do with, I say, trauma that has come from writing instruction over the years. Um, and so if I could put a dent in that, or just shift, people's experiences in minor ways or small ways, that seemed very important. And then my role as a WPA, or writing program administrator, really allowed for us to begin to kind of restructure how we thought about writing at HBCU. And that's something that was just always very important. I think teachers and other administrators have always done this in very subtle ways, whether it's the inclusion of certain texts, whether it is the discussion of Black language, whether it's discussion of rhythm and sound, in addition to kind of structure, punctuation, even how we talk about syntax. They've always done this in subtle ways, but I always thought it was important to not be subtle, in this regards, especially at a historically Black university, where I think students are coming for a different kind of experience than they perceive, at their traditional school settings. And so they really want to know about their culture, customs, background. And so one of the questions I've always been thinking about is, well, what are those customs and cultural practices that change or alter how we think about writing? So rather than um, thinking about invention and the outline first, what are kind of the composing practices that Black folks employ that may be a little bit more creative or inventive or fun, that may also make us think a little differently about how we may use our language. So, for like example, I mentioned music. The idea of rhythm being central to that was important. If that is the case, um, we have to think a little bit differently about how we grade language, what we decide is or isn't grammatical. And in asking those questions, it can become a dialogue with students in particular ways. And so that's always been a vital part of my pedagogy, is being in conversation with students about their work, um, trying to understand the perspective of what the writer is trying to express, in addition to ways that we may, or strategies we may employ to express those things in more effective ways. bring home the point and much faster, be able to have a little pop to our sentences, pop to our paragraphs, um, and be able to do that kind of dynamic work that really makes writing fun to me. And so it's the work to kind of blend the kind of cultural knowledge that is available to us uh, around Black expressive culture, language, and so forth, with some of the more structural techniques, practices, histories, lessons that we have related to writing instruction. And so I've always and tried to promote, teachers kind of doing that or experimenting with that in their own classroom. So that has looked a number of different ways, from incorporating kind of larger language statements around Black English, Ebonics, um, to thinking more structurally about the demands we make on students, the way race may inform subtly some of the bias that may occur in student grading. And so it just provides a plethora of ways to kind of think about what's going on in the writing classroom, um, and how Black culture provides an intervention that can be important in that learning process. That's really been at the heart of my interest in work, and so that's how I come to rhetoric. Really, African American rhetoric is central, and then the larger field of rhetoric is important to that as well. Um, and then using that to kind of inform different ways of thinking about writing, which is just a beautiful art form that I think doesn't get as much credit as other areas, just because of its association with schooling and so forth. So even in popular culture, but even in at our university, the ways we talk about writing, creative writing is something that we consider a little bit different than writing or writing studies. And to
Mhm.
me, that's not necessarily the case. These things blend. They do different things, but they're very related. The creative skills that I may use for a short story can be just as valuable in explaining an idea or working through a problem, and so on and so forth with poetry and the ways that we think about the creative work and how it informs our work. So Black culture, Black studies has been vital to thinking through those different divides. I don't want to say it's a boundary breaker, but boundaries exist differently in Black culture, and that kind of reorients how we think about what's possible in relationship to language, speech, culture, and so forth. Um, and we see it all the time. We just don't always mark it, right? It is
Mhm.
Barack Obama beginning with Al Green before he makes before he starts off his speech. It is that affinity to break into song, to break into dance, to celebrate, different events or momentous occasions before we get to the language work of the speech, or before we get into the actual essay. It is important to describe what is happening on stage at Kendrick Lamar's concert.
Yeah.
Because this is a cultural moment, so how do we take those cultural moments and understand them in relationship to either larger messaging or what's happening with the discourse? I think that's what Black Studies allows me to kind of do and think about in my role as somebody invested in writing, and writing instruction writ large.
So you mentioned Kendrick Lamar. So, what about what specifically, right, about like hip hop culture, and maybe even hip hop studies, do you feel like is integral to thinking about Black studies, but also thinking about writing studies and composition studies?
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. Hip hop has really been the thing that helps me stitch all this together. I haven't mentioned it that way, but it is really. I mean, we know in hip hop, most people either talk about rap or talk about the music. We also talk about the dress. We can talk about the dancing. But to me, there are these different features from Black culture that become solidified within hip hop that gives us a new lens on how we think about things. And so, one of those features is the blend. It is that ability to take these different elements, blend them, and think about them into a cohesive unit or lens for how we talk about or discuss or think about things in particular ways. It's also this practice of layering, right? This layering of information, of images, of ideas, right? That becomes important because it provides both, a chance to critique or comment on what's happening, but it challenges some of our assumptions about what goes together, what doesn't. And then really, hip hop's affinity to move across this continuum of the sacred and the profane has always been valuable, and especially for my understanding of Black culture. Um, and so at times that has meant, how I think about, for example, Black memory as opposed to simply just Black history, but Black memory being right. Black history, we know the civil rights movement occurred. We know different dates of different events. We know the story of how, say, the Montgomery bus boycott came about, what occurred, and what the resolution was. But the memory aspect is what allows us to think differently about the narratives of that time. And so it's like Rosa Parks is an important figure in that narrative. So is Claudette Colvin. So is
Mhm.
Mary Louise Smith. So is, Joanne. Um, Joanne. I'm I'm blanking for a little bit, but so are all these different kinds of figures, Edie Nixon, and the roles that they play in those stories. Because to me, it gives a much fuller kind of expression of what happened in that moment, right? So, what were the working class people going through? What
Mhm.
were folks who had jobs either as maids or they worked in other people's houses? How was this publicity received? What did it do to their lives? What lessons can we learn? What were the social customs and etiquette around the time? And it's like, the ways it can be presented sometimes it's like Black people didn't cuss until 1985 or something. But it's like, no, people was cussing back then. So who were the cussing folks and who were the folks? Where did they cuss at? How is this cussing going on? And how did it inform, what was happening? Did it drive home a point? Did it draw people's attention? To me, those are the most interesting parts of kind of the civil rights history, and it really provides different pathways for folks and it fleshes out a number of different things. And so in that way, memory can be just as vital as history in that regard because it provides a different texture um, to how we understand stories, events, people. It's much fuller expansion to know that Dr. King played pool,
Mhm.
uh, and that he owned guns, and it's like, oh, so this is an evolution of somebody who is working towards this idea of civil disobedience, and not somebody who is just the exceptional Black man. He's exceptional, but not the exceptional token in some of the ways that narratives kind of characterize different Black figures throughout history. Um, right? It takes a very powerful and strong mind to kind of stand up and deliver on the different events, practices that he was a part of, put himself at risk in the ways that he did, and also rise to the moment with the kind of thoughtful speeches that he was able to do. But he was also human, and there was other people that were also human and had this full kind of expressiveness that I know to be more true of Black culture. You know, my grandmother went to church, and she also cussed at times at the kitchen table. And sometimes it was affectionate, sometimes it was to make a point. It functioned in all these different various ways. And to me, that's the beauty of how I remember her. Is also the beauty of how I understand Black culture, that it is variegated, that there are different levels, customs, expectations. There's no singular way to be Black. Folks are complex in their beliefs, in their practices, their customs, and what they do. And so memory allows for that complexity. That becomes very important. And hip hop allows us to remember in different ways, right? So, because it's always about that blend. How do we go back to go forward? What snippets or elements do we take to kind of recontextualize and think about what's happening now? What do certain songs, music, literature remind us of the past, and also how do they point us to a different direction in the future? To me, that has always been, the beauty of hip hop, right? So I mentioned Kendrick Lamar, like even the Not Like Us beat, if you trace the origins of that beat and kind of where it comes from, what's being symbolized or signified, in its usage, alongside, what he's rapping about and what he's suggesting and saying in particular phrases. It is this kind of complex movement between past and present, in a number of ways that is also celebratory, um, and chastising, and all the things that come with it. So to me, that's always been like the beauty of it is the blend, it is the layer, it is those signifying traditions and the ways it gets employed in hip hop is just so focused. It is, in some ways, to me, hip hop is a rhetorical tool of Black culture, that is not always situated that way. Um, but in that regards, it provides, as I mentioned, rhetoric is my way into writing. Um, Hip hop rhetoric is partly my way of thinking about, well, how do we make sense of the things we want to expose students to? I think in many ways, the conventional approach has been to start, say, at the beginning, and do a linear fashion. We're going to look at Frederick Douglass, what is the 4th of July, to the Negro, and we're going to move forward in time in that way. And that's not always the best, approach. Sometimes it's important to put Douglass, in conversation with Kendrick Lamar, or put, Dr. King in conversation, with, say, a Chuck D or a Tribe Called Quest, or different folks that are talking to us about certain problems that have evolved over time, um, and being able to touch back and forth, be able to make sense of the past for the present in ways that are useful now and for folks moving forward. And that's really just what hip hop has always provided me in that way. In terms of the writing, the beauty of it is that it's such a writing culture, whether we think of formal writing by hand with a pen, or even just the crafting of language and images, right? Hip hop folks are always writing in some kind of ways. One of the most beautiful and under discussed kind of compositions, I said, 21st century, was the Lemonade visual album, right?
Mhm.
I think because of how we've been trained to listen to music, it's like we're gonna separate that and think about video separate from the actual music. And it's like, no, it was conceived of as a project that was meant to be visual alongside the language and the music. Um, and so it becomes a model for what's possible and how we talk about writing and think about writing in these different, boundaries that we set up. And what is it that we're trying to do? Do we want somebody who can just produce a 5 paragraph essay or treatise on a particular topic? Or are we trying to train people to think about communication in dynamic ways, that they may have to use for their jobs or their own personal experience? If it is the latter, the ways we perhaps think about writing and how that is presented has to shift. Hip hop is a great model for that. We're thinking about the work of visual culture in our actual writing. We're thinking about the different parts or processes of writing, in and of itself. So even just the part of language choice or language crafting, there's a whole, number of rappers who just really do a type of language rap.
Mhm.
Ghostface, Killer, West Side Gun. Uh, there's another, one of my favorites, folks, Cooley High. Who am I thinking of? Cooley High. I can see it so clearly. Sonny Chiba. Uh, uh, Camp Low. Thank you. Woo. The group Camp Low is one of those central kind of rap acts that really practices language raps. And so it's people who are just using rhythmic words that evoke different images and ideas alongside each other. There is no distinct storyline other than I'm going to show you my mastery of the English vocabulary, and ability to kind of rhyme it in particular ways. That becomes useful in how we think about syntax, vocabulary, what's possible, how language or terms can be stretched, how terms can be reemployed to mean different things, how chiasmus works, or the inversion of particular ideas, about a term and what it can mean, how those things work. Right? They provide all these different models for what we might be asking our writers to think about and do. And so it becomes a um, if all of these things are possible, how do we begin to organize them in the way that provides an instructive approach to students about what writing can be or what writing is? And so for me, that's the fun part is we don't necessarily have to spend, 5 weeks parsing, or diagramming sentences. learning learning about a lot of this technical language when we can look at some of it being performed and demonstrated for us in particular ways. And we can also ask students to creatively begin to think about these things, how syntax works, what is the rhythm of what I'm trying to provide, how do you move from old information to new information in ways that are compelling to people that want to listen, read, and hear what you're talking about. Um, and so hip hop has been vital to that, so just those different elements, the blend, the layering. I think I forgot about voice. Voice is so important to the culture, whether we're talking about the actual musicality of someone's voice, their ability or confidence to just speak up about something that may be controversial or that people just are unwilling to talk about, in the ways that people choose to be authentic about their voice, whether that is through certain vulgar images or certain um, different kinds of language use that is unorthodox. All of this stuff is about how one is crafting their voice for public consumption. And so voice is, probably the last element I would like to think about, relative and important to both writing and Black studies, and how we think about hip hop's relationship to both. Um, and what we do. In addition, I think I said memory as well, but all those things become very important. And hip hop becomes this kind of rhetorical tool for me to do that kind of work. So you asked this question, I appreciate it because I don't often get to talk about how it informs, what I do in these ways. Um, but it's just so vital. It's vital to my pedagogy. Um, I think I read Teaching to Transgress in one graduate classroom, and just how Bell Hooks talked about the teacher as a full person with emotions and somebody who was meant to kind of educate full people in ways of about not just their kind of structural knowledge of things, but their emotional, social, cultural, communal knowledge as well. Um, and it was like at a moment, I was like, "Well, hip hop can help me do that in a bunch of different ways." It was like, "Oh, this is part of what Black Studies has been providing or suggesting." It's like, no, these things are important just beyond a kind of historical example. They're important because they let us understand kind of the functional practices that people are using at times to do particular things. When people are rhyming, or people are playing language games, or people are joking each other, or people are signifying. Um, Taraji P. Henson's very direct form of signifying at the BET Awards, just addressing all of that's been happening in the current political landscape, um, with regards to a variety of issues. That's important. It is an important moment. It is substantive, and I think it's important for people to understand what's happening. So why is what she's saying having the effect that it's had for a number of different viewers, and why is that important? Um, to a large regard, hip hop gives me a lens to kind of begin to talk about that with people, just because it suggests that we should pay attention to her bodily performance, her facial expressions, as well as the words in which she is saying, the emotion behind them, and what all those things were being conveyed to certain audiences, and why it becomes viral and circulates Black digital culture in ways that it does.
Thank you. That was interesting and informative, and it definitely made me think a lot about when I was teaching writing. I know that after the, Kendrick Lamar run of Not Like Us that has happened so far, like, I really miss teaching reading in this moment because I think it just provides there's so much. I was
Mhm.
telling my sister, like, I have to figure out how I'm gonna work this into my
There's so
non-writing
much to discuss.
because
Yeah.
there's so much that can be said, like you said, about communication, but not just like the ideas that are being communicated and the connection between the past and the present, and thinking about the rhythm and the roots of that particular beat or sound in the voice and the words, but also just the celebration and the community aspect of it. There's just
Mhm.
so much in this particular run, and I'm like, I just need to go teach a writing course real quick. And then,
I'll be right back.
yeah, let me give me a course release so I can go teach writing real quick.
Yeah,
What is
I'm long-winded, but I just like you. I'm like, man, these viral moments mean something, in ways that are useful. Um, and so yeah, and writing it's an interdisciplinary practice, so it's such a beautiful space to kind of, engage this stuff.
Yeah, it really is. One of the things that you said that I thought was really beautifully put, but also super important was this idea of memory and not just history. And so thinking about memory and not just history, right? What interests or excites you most about the memory of Black studies?
Oh, um, there's so much. I think for right now, um, I've been really drawn back to thinking about the 70s, 80s, and 90s as a precursor to where we're at now. And just a different kind of, as we talked about, we didn't call them that back then, but those viral moments that were
Mhm.
happening, right? Those moments that were shaping the kind of the landscape to where we're at now. But there's so much it's so hard to choose. It's partly why I become an interdisciplinary scholar because I can't just focus on, one moment or one era because all of it connects back in different ways. And I've come to love and appreciate folks, like Robin D.G. Kelly, um, our friend Kyle Wabana Mays, right? Folks who, give us those detailed engagements with history and what's happening and why these things are happening. Because they give me the story and then it becomes so useful to ask the question, well, what was happening underneath that? Why was this person either excised from, broader public history, or why are they not mentioned as much as they should be? And that way it reminds me of the music too. It's like, why aren't we talking about this artist when we should be, these people music is good too. SZA, why is this SZA's album being talked about as much as, so and so's album or whatever? I say for right now, what has been kind of grabbing my interest has really been what we've described as, say, the culture wars in the 80s, and that comes out of the kind of larger progressive movement in the 70s to include Black studies formally in academic spaces as an area of study, and what that became to look like. I know for African American literature, what that has looked like and what that has meant. Um, and I've become interested in part because I think there's the formal narrative of how African American literary studies or really Black literary studies has come to be something that exists on everyone's curriculum in a variety of ways in English studies, but we don't always quite know how it got there or why it's so important. I think those of us who study it, do. I think for the larger cultures, just like, oh, this is our moment to kind of learn about Black writers, or it becomes that rather than understanding that this was part of a larger structural goal to one begin to define the complexity of Blackness, for ourselves as thinkers, writers, folks who are intervening in different parts of the culture. Um, and then also, this is important to our larger kind of narrative about what the study of language, literature, and literacy has meant, for people over time. And so both those things, become, extremely important. And just trying to understand, the history behind it. One particular moment might be the IAH conferences at Howard University, basically a interdisciplinary humanities conference run by a lot of Black writers and Black studies scholars and critics at that time, and really becoming a space for us to think about, what community means, how trauma is affecting folks, being able to see just moments um, Barbara Christian and Sonia Sanchez and June Jordan and Toni Morrison are all in the same space talking with us about, what some of these different things mean for the Black community, both psychologically, both in terms of its symbolism and its value, to the culture. Um, and being able to trace that, to the evolution and these different moments where even that history gets submerged and hidden from us in particular ways. And so Black studies and then Black literary studies becomes this kind of very academic practice, which when it didn't begin that way. It began, very much as a cultural communal practice
Mhm.
about the complexity, of Black folks, inside and outside of the academy. It always had that kind of function. And I think that can get lost if we don't know the history that's connected to it. I know in literature that can easily get lost. Um, they begin to think about African American literature only as the publication of certain texts, rather than what the conversation was around those texts. Um, and it reminds me of like the mixtape conversation.
Mhm.
Mixtapes, physical mixtapes are so hard to find, but for a lot of people, they were just as transformative as the formal albums that were released, as well. And so I think like, John A. Williams, The Man Who Cried I Am, is a text that kind of gets lost or overlooked at times. In different eras, Gail Jones' work, beyond Corregidor, but also her work on healing and other kind of novels that she's written gets lost or submerged over time. And really, I'm asking those questions about why did that happen? What is happening in these particular moments? Because there are viral moments out there when these texts are circulating, people have book clubs around them, things are happening. And this is a moment, and then it gets lost in particular ways. And so that kind of interest in recovery work really, as I said, the roots begin in the 70s, but working through to where we're at now becomes very important because it becomes important to understanding Kendrick Lamar's relevance, but also J. Cole, but then people I love, Mick Jenkins and Jid and so on and so forth, their relevance to how we think about Black literature and storytelling in the current moment, as well. And so how we work not to have those things get lost, especially in a space in which our attention span can be taken just like
Mhm.
that. So how do we keep them on the curriculum? How do we keep them in conversation with these other works? And I think looking back to that moment in which Black studies becomes more formalized is very important. Particularly Black studies in relationship to literature becomes formalized in academia becomes very important because it's a moment in which scholars had to make tough decisions about where they stood relative to the literature and its usage, what made sense, and where to put kind of pressure on and how we think about things. Right, this isn't just a Black copy of or version of what is already happening, say, in traditional history studies or traditional literary studies. This is something different, and I think that was a moment in which that was being discussed. Um, and so that's become kind of really grabbed my attention and interest right now. Um, uh, and kind of thinking about that relative to the African American novel, relative to African American poetry, rap, so on and so forth. So I hope I answered the question.
Mhm.
But
You did.
memory. You say memory, woo.
That it was so your answer and really thinking about these viral moments of the past, it's also super interesting because I think that too often we don't conceptualize them that way, right? Like you said, in a time when attention spans may not be what they once were, and there are the viral moments are so quick and big that it can be easy to like forget, okay, but this was viral too, and it looked different, but it also was a huge moment culturally.
Yeah.
We can't forget that. Like thinking
Mhm.
about how these texts and ideas came to be in more traditional disciplinary classrooms and what that means, like losing that meaning. That I think that's really important. So thank you.
Mm.
Okay.
You're
Last
welcome.
question, because I don't want to, waste any more of your time. But
Oh,
what
it's so fun.
what interests and excites you most about the future of the field?
Oh, um, So much, so much. I think the possibilities are just infinite. I really gained so much joy reading with a lot of folks have been dropping lately. Um, older Trisha Rose, Eddie Glau, folks who have been working since the '90s, but also folks who've been dropping just so much work more recently. Brandon Irby. I mean, even the work you're doing is like so exciting. So I'll try to make this coherent in a particular way, but it is this possibility that the digital, the visual, all of our different senses can really be engaged in very dynamic ways that don't have to create a hierarchy. Um, and how we consume knowledge and think about knowledge, especially around Black culture. So it is that possibility of the blend. I go back to my term, the blend, that is really most exciting. Just to see what folks are suggesting to us about Black digital culture, and I think for many of us, this is the way our world moves. We move from X, that used to be Twitter, Instagram, and these new platforms keep jumping up, but they're all ways of thinking about not just viral moments, but ways of thinking about how culture moves, in the digital space, and then back into kind of the literal plane, or into certain material experiences in very seamless ways. And so you can go from commenting on Twitter or X right into your classroom discussion with your students in a number of ways, and it could filter through them and back into these different digital platforms that they may be using. That is so exciting. Our ability to kind of integrate and think about visual text alongside written or oral text that we may be delivering has been so vital. The ability to respond in real time with just audio or visual clips or memes is so exciting. All because it suggests, a need for a deeper understanding of the blend, but it also feels more accurate to how I understood Black culture. Um, uh, the complexity and layered nature of it. We didn't have camera phones and things back in the day, but you remember when folks were playing the dozens, or even just the rhyming games, people jumping rope. It was a lot of action and activity happening at once that we all had to process in a bunch of different ways in order to understand what was happening culturally. And so I think we're at a similar moment. It is just the technology assists us in different ways. It also pushes us to think about, what's possible in different ways, and formal and informal settings. So before, these things were just strictly for the informal. It's made its way into formal knowledge in ways that I love and value. So that's what's most exciting to me, probably, is to blend, that understanding of it, not just in terms of language, but also in terms of visual and material cultures as well. So that's been, like the thing that excites me the most is like, okay, where we gonna go next? What's possible? What's happening? Um, and so the different ways that manifests, and people keep doing different and interesting things with it, and it's so fun to watch, from the music videos to the short kind of independent movies people are filming and putting up on Instagram and YouTube and all these other platforms as well now. And so it's a much more seamless move. I can move from the BET Awards to this Black soap opera I like to watch on YouTube to back to, different forms of reading, either on my tablet or with a physical book. It is the movement between all of those different things that the blend becomes important, because we have to understand what they're doing, so we're not just um, disconsciously or unconsciously kind of moving through these things, and we have a certain kind of conscious and critical awareness of what we're doing and why, um, and can be more intentional in certain ways. And so, like his last comment about Kendrick Lamar, is I think if we think about his contribution to writing and literature, um, that is probably the biggest contribution, is his ability to make us kind of think deeply about some of the questions, images he's providing, all of the things that he's providing all at the same time, right? And so he does this concert. He has a particular wardrobe on. He does a particular set of songs. He invites different people up for each one of them, and we can critique those choices. But we also have to understand them all as a larger kind of compositional statement
Mhm.
that he's making, and it's like, okay, there's a model. Who's gonna come with a different one next? And so that's been a real exciting thing. In terms of kind of work, my colleague Josh Myers has been doing some innovative things. We're thinking about the future of like what is Black studies kind of moving forward. That has been real palpable and useful to me. Um, and just a number of other folks who've been doing interesting work, right? They're reminding us of what's come before, but also like, what's out there. And so that the blend is, the thing I'm most excited about. Um, and it's the thing that allows me to make a kind of coherence out of all of this stuff that's available to us now.
Thank you. That is exciting. It's got me thinking about all different kind of things now, and teaching in classes and what the school year might look like. So I really appreciate your time and ideas and conversation. It was super interesting. And yeah.
I appreciate it as well. This was fun. You got me thinking. These questions were really thought out. So you got me thinking too. So like, hey, I stay in all these different places. But that reflective awareness is just so important. I appreciate conversation for that reason. And I appreciate you inviting me to do this conversation with you for that reason.
Well, thank you so much again. You have a wonderful rest of your day.